Just look at this yummy apple pear sauce. I left it a little chunky this time. Join me today while we put to use these apples and pears that are really ripe and ready to go. I need to get these taken care of and preserved so that they don't ruin and end up in the compost. So, hey, howdy y'all. This is Angie and welcome to Whiskey Woman Whisk. As you can see, I do have a few pears left from my Azure order that we got not too long ago and some bruising there. Starting to go bad, little spots, but they are absolutely delicious and I don't want them to go to waste. So first I'm gonna just give a rinse to my apples and my pears. Most of this is organic, but there are a few apples that aren't. I'm gonna use that wash there from Trader Joe's and I'm gonna just soak them in this water for a little bit. Just get them cleaned up and ready for me to start to work on. So while I've got these apples and pears soaking in that enzyme wash, I'm gonna go ahead and get me some water with lemon juice. So I've got really cold water from the fridge and lemon juice in a bowl ready to peel my apples and pears into, and that will kind of help prevent some browning because it will take me a little bit of time to get these peeled up before we can start cooking them down for our applesauce. So we'll just get these rinsed up, and then I went ahead and got my apple peeler core slicer doohickey. I believe mine is Pampered Chef. I've got it connected to my counter, so I will definitely be using that today just to help me out on getting all these apples peeled. I'll put a link in the description for a similar, this one is ancient. I mean ancient. So I don't even know if this one's available. There may be another one. If you have a Pampered Chef lady, you can check in with her. Otherwise, I'll look for one on Amazon and put a link there for you. But it is such a time saver when you're peeling apples. I love this thing. So I'm gonna go ahead and get these apples started. This one pretty much just peels the apple and takes the core out as well. I'll go back through, of course, every apple is shaped differently. So I'll go back through them and make sure there's nothing left of the core. And if there's any bad spots, cut that off. But you might have noticed I put a bowl in the sink. I'm gonna save these peels. We'll throw them in a jar and make some scrap vinegar with it. And that'll come in handy to have that on hand as well. So let me get to it with all of this peeling. This is definitely the most time consuming part. It's not hard, it just takes a little bit of time. So here I have my big pot that I'm gonna cook these apples and pears down in. And because it takes a few minutes for those apples to start releasing their juices, I went ahead and put about a cup of water in the bottom of the pot. Now I'm just gonna start going through here, double checking if there's any core that got missed by that tool that I can cut that out. So it's a quick and easy thing to just go through, make sure there aren't any bad spots or any pieces of the core left, and go ahead and get those filling up this pot. I'm gonna work on this for a few minutes and we'll be cooking up some apples pretty soon. Well, that's it for the apples. I've got those all in the pot, sliced up and checked. I'm going to put these peels and cores in a jar. I'm just going to set those aside and I'll get back to those in a few minutes. The thing about a task like this, peeling and coring, and it can take a little bit of time and it can feel quite daunting. I just utilize this time to listen to my favorite podcast. I've usually got my iPad sitting here and I'm watching a favorite YouTuber, learning some new tricks or a fun recipe I can try this week. So just give yourself something to do. Listen to an audiobook or the podcast that you haven't been able to get to lately. And that just makes this time double useful and makes the time go by while you're doing just the work in the kitchen that can be daunting. So get you something entertaining to do and let's get to peeling up these pears. In case you're curious, it's not necessary for safe canning to peel your pears and apples. It is a preference thing. I've done it with and without. I'll especially sometimes leave the peels in if they're organic, first of all, and if I don't have a lot of blemishes to worry about. But especially if I'm going to be pureeing and making a really smooth sauce, nutrients of the peels in the sauce and puree it down really good. It's smooth then and no one even notices the peels. So sometimes I'll do that. It just depends on what I'm going to be using it for and what condition my apples are. So that is a preference thing. So if you don't feel like peeling them and all of those criteria are good for you, leave those peels in there and puree them in. That's perfectly safe. I'm trying to cut in close here so that I can show you in case you've never peeled pears before. They're actually really easy to core. You can feel with your finger the seeds there. It just kind of dips out. You can even see the slightest tint of color from where the seeds are. So I don't know if you could tell that, but you can feel it in the area. So you can just kind of scrape that little spot out, but it's just straight, and then you can see it sort of colored there, and you just dip down right there where those seeds are, and they're super easy, especially if your pears are really ripe, to get that little seed section out of there. So I'm just going to finish peeling and coring these pears, and then we're going to be ready to start cooking up our sauce. Here we go. That was about 7 pounds of apples and 7 pounds of pears. Now I'm going to get these on the stove and start cooking them down. So I'm going to put these on the stove and we're going to put it on about medium heat. Remember, we do have a little bit of water in the bottom of the pot so that once our apple starts to break down and make its own juices, we have a little protection there. But until then, we need to add a little water to the bottom. And I'm going to cover them, let them start cooking down. It should only take about 15 to 20 minutes. But once they start really falling apart, then you know they've softened up enough. And then we'll get to pureeing those in a little bit. So this time I'm not going to really spice up my sauce. I want to be able to use them in cakes and muffins and, whatever recipes that I want to be able to use. And then I'll spice whatever that item is accordingly. So I'm going to leave these pretty plain. I am probably going to taste it and sweeten it a little bit with sugar, but for the most part I'm going to leave them to... I've decided I'm going to use my Presto electric pressure canner for water bath canning. This is a water bath recipe, and you can water bath can in this electric pressure canner as well. So I'm just preparing that. You don't fill it up all the way right now. You just go ahead and get to the line and put your jars in with some water just to get those heating up so that when we put that hot sauce in the jars, they're good and warm, so we're not risking any glass temperature changes causing any cracks in our glass. So I'm just prepping that at the moment while our applesauce is heating up and softening our apples. So I'm going to check back in on my apples now, give them a stir, check their softness, make sure nothing's sticking to the bottom, adjust my temperature if need be, just to make sure none of that sugar that's breaking down is going to scorch to the bottom of the pan. So be sure you give a check on your sauce every now and then. And so back to my canner, I've got my jars in there. We need to put the lid on, and you actually do lock it down and set it where we need it. We're going to be doing pints, so I can set this digital electric canner for the time and for water bath canning. So it's pretty cool how it's pretty automated. It's going to heat up my jars for me. It's going to let me know when they're ready, and I will take them out, dump out the water, and start filling my jars. So now that that's kind of on autopilot, I'm going to go back and check on my sauce again. We're going to give it a stir, see how it's breaking down, if it's soft enough yet. And as you can see, I've still got some pretty big chunks. I didn't cut my pears up as small as my apples because they were so ripe, but I can just kind of break them up with this spoon, get those to start softening up. It won't be long. It'll only take about 15-20 minutes for these to really soften up good. But you'll know when you can break them apart pretty easily, it's time to get out the immersion blender. That's what I'm using. You could definitely carefully, because it is hot, pour this into a blender of any sort and break it up. And how smooth you blend it is totally up to your preference. But also, if you don't mind them being a little bit chunky, you could totally use a sturdy potato masher and just give them a good mash once they're good and soft. So it's been about 20 minutes, and as you can see, my apples and pears have broken down pretty good. I've got more liquid breaking down into the sauce. Now, I've got about 14 pounds of cut up apples and pears, but for every 5 to 7 pounds of apples or apples and pears, you can add sugar. Totally optional, it's not required. I'd give it a taste and then season to your family's liking. You can use half a cup up to 2 cups per 5 to 7 pounds of apples. You definitely want to make sure that you add in a little bit of lemon juice. I don't believe that it's technically required for safety, but it brightens it just a little bit, and I like that. It's almost like adding salt to food. It just helps enhance the flavor. So I'm going to add a couple of tablespoons here of some lemon juice. At this time, you could also add in any apple pie spice or cinnamon, whatever your preferences are there. I sometimes do like to make seasoned applesauce, but like I said before, this one I want to leave chunky, and I want to be able to use it for multiple recipes and purposes, even if it's just applesauce. If it's just applesauce, we can add some spices to it when we're ready to eat it. So I'm gonna get those spices and sugars stirred in there. I've given it a taste a couple of times to see if it's to our liking on the sweetness level. And be sure and do that before you can it up. You can taste it and add any spices, sugar, lemon juice. Now I'm just going to use my immersion blender and smooth this out a bit. Like I said, I want to leave it a little bit chunky this time. But for me, the immersion blender is my favorite tool in the kitchen. So I'm going to just blend it, stir it around, get it to the broken down smoothness that we like, and then it will be ready to can. Okay, so this is looking at the texture that I believe I want this batch to be. Totally up to you, smooth or chunky. And I'm gonna grab me a spoon and give it a taste now that it's all pureed. Make sure it's at the sweetness and brightness that I like. And hard sometimes. You don't want to add too much to it to use for multiple purposes, but maybe just a little more sugar. And honestly, it really just depends on your fruit, how sweet it is, if what type of apples you're using, how ripe the fruit is. That will all determine just how sweet your applesauce is when you're making it. So just taste it a couple of times and get it to your family's liking with adding a sugar in or none at all. Totally optional, but I've decided to add a little bit of salt. Salt brings out the sweetness. I know that sounds crazy, but it really does. So a little bit of salt going in mine, but that is totally optional for you. I know, I said I wasn't going to, but I just can't help myself. I'm going to add, it's not even a full teaspoon, maybe 3/4 teaspoon of some apple pie spice. Give that a stir, just make sure that spice is distributed throughout, and then we're going to start canning up. So I'm going to pull my jars out of my electric canner. It's been ready, so they're already hot and ready to put this hot applesauce into hot jars. Now I've brought over some more jars, clean jars, that I'm going to be using as well, because I know this applesauce is going to fill up more than one canner load, but it's only going to go for like 15 minutes. So as I pull these out and they have water in them that's hot, I'm going to go ahead and use that water again, pour that water off into my other clean jars that'll be for my next batch, sit that jar aside that I'm going to be filling with applesauce. So that's all I'm going to do here is just fill new clean jars with the hot water so that they can start warming up for the next round. And now let's get to filling our jars with applesauce. Well, it's apple pear sauce. A funnel definitely helps. I've got my funnel here, and I'm just going to get my jars filled up. We want to leave a 1/2 inch of headspace. Be sure and debubble. This is pretty liquidy, so I didn't even use my debubbler. I just kind of gave them a tap on the counter, and that'll help release any bubbles to the top. It's pretty liquidy, so it's usually not too big of a concern there. But if you would like to just be sure, use a debubbler or a chopstick, give it a little stir and knock out any bubbles that are in your jar. Make sure you're filling to 1/2 inch headspace, and that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to go ahead and finish filling these jars. Let me get a few of them going. My canner is just keeping warm. It's on autopilot, and I love that about the electric canner. So now that we've got some jars filled up, I've got some vinegar in a little bowl here and a paper towel. I'm going to give all of these rims a good wipe down to make sure there's nothing sticky, no residue on that rim, because we want to make sure our jars seal up. So I'm just going to go ahead and wipe them all down really good with some vinegar. And now time for our lids and rings. Of course, I've given my lids a wash earlier. So we're going to get our lids on and put our rings on fingertip tight. That means you just want to use your fingertips and not put your wrist into it and crank it down. Fingertip tight is all you'll be needing for this. And just look at this beautiful, yummy applesauce. You can see I've left a little bit of chunkiness to it. Won't that be delicious? Warmed up with breakfast or as a side dish or even as just a nice little snack treat. So we're going to get these rings on and get them in our canner, which is already heated. So this electric canner, it will only hold regular mouth jars. It'll hold 8 pints. So it's not quite as many as if you were using a regular water bath canner, which will hold more at a time. But this is a quick 15-minute round, then some cool down time, and I can put my next batch in. Meanwhile, I can be tending to other things and not have to worry with it. And it beeps at me and lets me know when it's ready. It's fantastic. This is the second round, but I forgot to say, make sure your jars are covered with at least an inch of water over the top of the jars, even in this electric pressure water bath combo canner. You'll need to make sure you've got that water level right. So my canner is cooled down, so I'm gonna open it up, but I'm still gonna tilt my lid and just give that a little more time to cool down before we pull them out. It's just a little insurance on making sure there's no siphoning because of the drastic temperature change. It is pretty cool right now in the house, so we'll let that cool down in the canner that extra 5 minutes or so. And then we're going to get these pulled out. You want to make sure you have a mat on your countertop, especially if it's easily damaged or if your countertop is cold. It's just best to have a mat down to protect your jars from that drastic shock in temperature. We're going to get these pulled out. We're going to leave them on this counter. I'll give them a check in about 10-12 hours just to make sure everything is sealed. If there's a jar that has not sealed by that time, I'll go ahead and once it's cooled down enough, put it in the fridge and use it in the next week. Everything else I will leave to 24 hours. Double check the seals, take my rings off, give the jars a wash just to make sure there's no leftover stickiness from applesauce underneath that ring or on the jar anywhere before we label it and put it on the shelf for future use. And so this next round will go even quicker as I put these jars back in the canner that already have water in them. They're pretty warm. The canner is pretty warm, so it'll heat up really quick and I'll get that next batch of applesauce going. Probably have 4 or 5 more jars worth left to can up and I'll be done with this project. So after getting that canner loaded, I've got just a little bit of sauce left, so I'm just going to enjoy it for a little snack. You definitely don't want to can any that you cannot completely fill a jar. Now I could have gotten a smaller jar, a half pint or quarter pint, and it would have been fine to can with the rest, but I'm just going to enjoy this little treat. And there you go. Homemade, home canned apple pear sauce. So good. Thanks for hanging out with me today, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a thumbs up and make sure you're subscribed. And as always, y'all have a good one.